look at me. All right, Jonathan Williams, you mentioned something really interesting. Tax receipt growth is twice as high by the 9 states with no income tax than the 9 states with the highest state income tax rates. That seems a little counterintuitive.
Well, yeah, it is. It's very counterintuitive because folks on the left would have you believe that if you eliminate your income tax, it's going to be the end of the world as you know it as a state. And the evidence is completely opposite of that. It's fantastic that twice as high the tax receipt growth in states without income taxes, and that is because of the age-old, really the axiom of tax policy is that you do not raise tax revenue through raising tax rates. You raise tax revenue through growing your tax base and attracting more taxpayers to your state, and that's the key to the success of the 9 states without income taxes. They're growing, people are voting with their feet very strongly. Your neighbors to the east in Texas have gained 4 congressional seats in the last 10 years alone. Look at all those taxpayers that are now paying taxes. They're not paying income taxes because Texas is one of those 9 states, but they're paying all the other state taxes.
So if New Mexico decided, okay, let's get rid of the personal income tax, how long would it take for things to turn around? Would there be 3 or 4 years where the tax receipts would go down because the state wouldn't be getting tax receipts from people because of no income tax, but then eventually it would come back? How long would it take for it to transition?
Well, I think that immediately, let's just start with this, immediately you would have a competitiveness effect where you're sending a very clear signal to businesses and individuals all across the country. New Mexico is open for business, and we're not going to be a state that taxes your productivity and your success and your profits. Profit's not a dirty word here. That would be the message that you would send immediately. Now, in terms of the revenue effects of it, it may have some transition period where you would have to go through some loss of revenue initially, but at the end of the day, the dynamic effects are going to far outweigh the static effects of the tax revenue loss initially.
Is there a state in the last 20 years or so that's done away with personal income tax, and what happened there?
Well, the state income tax is really the opiate of state government, as I like to say. Once you're hooked on the revenue, the state income tax, it's very hard to get off of it. And Alaska was the last state to eliminate its income tax. And they did that years ago. I think it was outside that 20-year horizon, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And they did that. Obviously, they had some inherent advantages. Every state has some inherent advantages, but Alaska's is pretty large with oil revenue. They were able to do it that way. So there has been some other plans that have been enacted. Delaware, for instance, years ago, took their marginal income tax rate from the high teens, believe it or not, it was in the high teens in the 1970s, to a very low competitive tax rate under what they call the DuPont plan. Governor DuPont started to Pete DuPont, phase out the income tax with surplus tax dollars. So it wouldn't cost anything. You would just use surplus dollars whenever that surplus dollars came in to buy down the marginal rate. And over time, he made that much progress. And so we've seen, actually in the last few years, many states take that strategy and say, instead of eliminating it all at once, let's have a phase down and use surplus dollars to phase out that rate. And I think that's probably a little bit more of a workable strategy if you look at the practicality of it.
Wouldn't liberals come back and say, well, we had 8 years of a Bush administration, George W. Bush that is, and where Republicans basically were able to ram through a lot of the things that they wanted, and yet the deficit went up? How do you explain that?
Well, as I talked about during my speech today, this is not about Republican versus Democrat. It's about good versus bad policy. And unfortunately, Republicans in the 2000s have spent way too much. They spent like drunken sailors in many cases, and that was the real cause of the shortfalls. There is that we had a surplus on paper starting into 2001. Obviously, with the market crash, that deteriorated rapidly. You had the Bush tax cuts, which were very pro-growth in 01 and 03, but then you saw things like Medicare Part D and huge expansion of entitlement spending, and probably the most expanded entitlement spending since the Great Society programs, along with many other discretionary spending. You saw the pork projects expand over time. Republicans did not behave like fiscal conservatives, and that was the downfall of that decade.
Last question for you. I know that a number of people would say supply-side economics didn't work, doesn't work, the Laffer curve doesn't work, neither does trickle down.
Right.
What's your response to that?
Right, it's the old voodoo economics line from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right, with Ben Stein. And they say, trickle-down economics fails. But at the end of the day, the concept of the Laffer curve is very clear and it's very hard to refute, is that people do change their behavior based on tax rates. They change based on incentives, and tax rates are very clear incentives. So at a 0% tax rate, you raise zero revenue. At a 100% tax rate, you raise zero revenue because people will not work for the privilege of paying taxes. And so that's basically the proof of supply side economics, is that's the behavioral change, that people do change their behavior. We know that to be the case. And that is basically Reaganomics, is that yes, tax incentives through marginal rate reductions do change people's behavior. They make profit taking more lucrative. They make working and investing and saving more lucrative. They take away the tax penalties at least, and that creates more of the activity, because at the end of the day, when you tax something, you get less of it. And if you're taxing productive activities like work, savings, and investment, you're going to get less of it than you would otherwise. And that's the basic of the Laffer curve, trickle-down economics, whatever you'd like to call it, but it works in the real world as much as the liberals would say otherwise.
Jonathan Williams, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.